We're not ready.
Okay, have to bring a little bell like on Sunday, get everybody off the patio and in. Okay. All right, hey, we may have a few people fall in once they get through the traffic. I try to join the men's breakfast for breakfast on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. And we meet at Wilma's patio on Balboa Island. What a mess that place is right now. They're replacing something that got half the streets torn up. It's already terrible, but now it's worse than terrible. So I've been eating and running quite a bit, just in order to get here in time to make coffee and so forth. Hello, Bill. Good to see you in person rather than on the Zoom here.
Good to be here in person.
All right, we do have Daryl and Betty on the Zoom. So if your name starts with a B, you're supposed to be on Zoom today. Happy to have them. All right, we've got an interesting text, I think. And as I was working on it over the weekend, I just told myself, I can't imagine making a 30-minute video on this. It just seems so complicated. And I just came in and thought, well, we'll see how it goes. And that video ended up being like 30 minutes and 1 second. I was really amazed, to be honest with you. So let me start by just, we'll have a word of prayer, and then I'll ask what kind of questions you have with regard to either the video or the text. So let's pray. Gracious God, open our hearts, open our mind, enable us to imagine a life beyond our self-interest. Amen. Okay, what kind of questions do you have from the video or the reading? If you're watching from home, go ahead and put it in the chat.
I don't have a question, I've got a comment.
Okay, we have a
I
comment.
realized yesterday that I cannot read the Gospel of John unless you interpret.
Well, there's a corresponding element to that.
Because John annoys me to no end, but after you get done explaining, I was like, oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So if you didn't hear, Deborah said she can't read the Gospel of John unless I accompany her through it. I have a similar thing that if I just sit down to read it, it just feels like it's going on and wandering here and there. When I sit down and think about, okay, how can I talk about this to other people who are interested? So when I think as a teacher, suddenly I start seeing things. It's kind of weird. This is not something I snuggle up with for devotional, whereas some of the Gospels are, and some of Paul's letters are. But when I start to look at it, I almost have to look at it analytically. And then I'm able to go back and read it devotion. I don't know if that makes sense, but a lot of times those two ways of reading seem like they're at odds with each other. And for the Gospel of John, for me, they really complement each other. But thanks for that comment. That's kind of nice to hear. Yes, Jerry.
Almost all of the studies we've done, at some point in a major way, you relate it back to us and the way we live and what is to be. This whole story of the seed dying and whatever, I kept waiting for you to say, okay, now we're the seeds and we die and whatever. You never did. Am I missing what's there? Did you just run out of 30 minutes and didn't have a chance to get to that part?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is yes, I ran out of time. And also, I got to leave myself something to preach on Sunday that you haven't already heard.
I love that.
I mean, come on. Last week, as you know, probably 80% of the sermon is something you'd already heard in the text study. So it doesn't make any sense for the text study and the sermon to be totally unrelated, but I also don't want to blow my wad, on Wednesday. So I didn't do that purposefully, but I will say that that metaphor of the seed dying, I've seen it a million times. And it's evident and obvious in some respect. We don't typically think of a seed dying and then we bury it and then it comes back to life. We just bury a seed. That strikes me as the key to John's view of the cross. And I don't think I've ever seen it quite like that. So if you don't mind, let's just kind of look at views of the cross for a minute and test the idea that maybe this is a profound one for us. We mentioned, I think we talked about this last week or sometime recently. I've gone on and on about this to somebody. The 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, is the one who articulated what we call the substitutionary atonement theory. Did we talk about this last week? Okay, either last week. Yeah. And yeah, so the idea was that sin dishonors God. And when you dishonor an honorable person because they're just, there has to be some kind of response, punishment, what have you. And so sin was our way of dishonoring God, and in God's justice, then we deserve death because God is just. At the same time, God is loving. And because God loves us, instead of giving us death, God sent God's only son to die, to suffer our death on the cross. And in doing so, Jesus was the substitute that atoned for our sins. And I still think that general theory is probably the most popular way that the cross is understood in the US. Which is why, and especially in evangelical churches, I think this is a very, very popular way of understanding the cross, which is why a lot of their songs go on and on about the blood, and kind of feels a little distasteful if you don't sing about it all the time. And then you go into a place and they're singing about blood. But it's all because of this kind of idea that in the cross, Jesus is actually taking our place. So that's one theory, and it's a very popular one. There's another theory, which I think last week's text supported in some respects. And that's also something I've talked to you about in the past, but it's just so profound. I want you to be familiar with it. And it's the work of the French literary critic named René Girard. Girard, Girard. He's incredibly hard to read. I think he, but his theory is the theory of the scapegoat. That it's the scapegoat mechanism is our most popular way of keeping peace. And what does he mean by that? He means that, well, you've seen it in movies, right? Think of the movie, I think it might be called 4th of July. Independence Day with Will Smith, right? And there's this large UFO hanging over the earth that's about to kill us all. And we tried communicating, that didn't work. And so, of course, the United States military has to solve the problem. And so Will Smith and all the nations of the world actually start cooperating a little bit. And it's Will Smith and his folks who laser it down or blow it up or something. And when it happens, they just show scenes from all around the world, like out in the Sahara and the mountains and in cities and all the languages, all the ethnicity, all the nations that had previously been at war with one another are all celebrating together because we killed that common enemy. Because nothing draws us together like a common enemy. it's a very, very common, often manipulative way of creating unity, is to find and vilify a common enemy. And Girard says that this is why the scapegoat process in the Old Testament is so effective. Is that, look at what they do. They get a goat, a literal goat, and the priest will lay his hands on the goat and will impute onto that goat all the sins of the community. And not just the bad words they said or thoughts they had, but the rivalries they have, the arguments they have over boundary markers, all the things that can tear a community apart. They impute all of that on the scapegoat, on this goat, and then they make it leave. They don't kill it, but they drive it out. And it was a way, obviously a artificial way, but a way of getting rid of all of their problems and giving them a renewed start. And that was a way of doing the scapegoat mechanism without necessarily violence. Typically, the scapegoat mechanism is a violent one. And so in Girard's argument, Jesus becomes the scapegoat for the religious leaders who don't like the way he's presenting God's path, and as well as the political leaders who feel like this new way of life, for which he's calling the real threat to the empire. And so you have the empire and the religion conspiring together to put to death this scapegoat. And the words that Girard comes back to all the time are from John, when Caiaphas says, it's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to suffer. That's the principle of the scapegoat. If we could just find this one person on whom, or this class. So during the Nazi regime, it was a Jew, or it was homosexual. For a lot of people today, it's these, transgender folk. And the point is, you rally your group by saying they're the ones threatening us, and if we just get rid of them, annihilate them, silence them, send them away, make them illegal, however, we'll be one. And that's an interesting way of looking at the cross, that it's not so much God's action, but that's how humans do. It's a destructive, violent system. That's how we do. So when you look at Jesus on the cross, you see that God sent Jesus to endure that. God sent Jesus. Jesus endured that. Maybe that's a better way of saying it, because that's how we make peace. But Girard argues that because Jesus is innocent, the resurrection is God's way of saying scapegoating doesn't work. The mechanism itself is exposed as being flawed. And then when you see that, all of a sudden it makes sense. Jesus says, love your enemy. Because if you don't, you're getting caught up in the scapegoat mechanism. Forgive those who have debts. Because if you don't, you're getting caught up in. So it's just a profound argument that when you see the bloody Jesus on the cross, don't say, well, God really wanted you to die to appease God's anger. But rather you say, we wanted you to die. Because that's how we get over ourselves. That's how we make peace. And God was willing to let Jesus do that. But through the resurrection, God exposes through Jesus' innocence the whole lie of the scapegoating mechanism. That's another way of looking at the cross. And I think that's very similar to how Jesus talked about it last week, when he was likening himself to the bronze serpent, where you had to look at the effects of your disobedience in order to be healed from those effects. A very profound thing. And as I was trying to say in the sermon, looking at Jesus on the cross shows us who we are as humanity. And until we see who we are as humanity, we can never be saved. Something like that. I think today's text gives us yet another way of thinking about it. That we often present as a paradox, right? And those who love their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake will gain it. If you want to be the greatest, you must be servant of all. If you try to be the greatest of all, you won't be. There's always that kind of paradoxical call to discipleship. But that paradox is grounded in this natural metaphor that unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground, dies, it will only remain a grain of wheat. Insofar as it dies, then it can fruit. That's a great way of looking at the cross. That for Jesus to remain Jesus, just a popular teacher, sticking it to the man, gathering disciples, healing, and so forth. Jesus could have done that. But as Paul Tillich put it, Jesus had to die as Jesus in order to be raised as the Christ. And I think that's how Paul sees our death and resurrection. So it's another way of looking at the cross, is Jesus letting go of whatever presumption, power, popularity he might have, in order that there will be bear fruit. In the 15th chapter, Jesus says, "Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit." So this whole idea about glory is that it's not about you. It's about bearing fruit for God. And so anyway, this metaphor, I think, presents yet another way of looking at atonement on the cross. And it's grounded in a natural fact. Does that make sense? Any of that helpful or bothersome? I mean, you've been hearing about the cross all your life. Worn one around your neck on many occasions. But
is there any tie-in between the parable where we sow the seed and some falls in the rocks and some falls in the fertile ground and some falls in the weedy ground?
right. Yeah, so I was looking at a commentary on John earlier this week, who said, and I don't think he's correct, he said that Jesus' language about the wheat dying and fruiting was influenced by this parable of the sower. I don't really see that at all. I mean, they're both banking on what we know is a common thing. Sow seeds and they grow. The parable of the sower really probably should be called the parable of the soils, because it's all about the place where the seed is embedded. I think it has an entirely different kind of point than this. The point of contact, the similarity between them is just that they both are parabolic statements based on what we know happened with the seed. Yeah. All right, any other questions?
I keep thinking the richness of the story, the words that lay out this story, and so much of the New Testament has these beautiful stories that are so visual. And I think, well, that was a time they didn't have television, they didn't have radio, they didn't have computers. Words and visualization from words was so much more important then than we can allow it today, because we have everything else distracting. And you could write what what John did in a wholly different way, say sort of the same stuff, but lose all the beauty of it. The way we communicate today. I just think that part of the New Testament, and really the Old Testament, just is. Words were the only way they had to communicate, and they use them so beautifully.
Yeah, that's great. And oral tradition for such a long time. You're right. So you had to be a good storyteller. We had an interesting conversation at breakfast this morning about trains of all things. And somebody pointed out, you know, it's so rare that someone comes up with a new thing. Usually, if you see all the problems with a train, we just try to make a better train. And if you see problems with a car, we just try to make a better car, a better cell phone, this, that. And it's rare that actually we just make a different thing that can help us accomplish the same purpose, just better. It's rare. And in his introduction to Mark, Paul Ochtermeyer argues really well that when Mark wrote his gospel, so we think that's the first of the four gospels to have been written out of the oral tradition, that he was kind of just really inventing a new genre. It's not really, you know, a legend, an ode, the kinds of stories we've seen before. It's a new genre that is about that's about the one sent from God, that includes parables, which had existed before, but now are in part of the story and utilized to embrace the story. It includes some, you know, storytelling of going into the city and doing this. It includes healing, it includes teaching, it includes discourse. And he argued that it's just kind of a new thing. You don't really find anything else in the first century that's really like that. When they would write about the lives of the Caesars or something like that, it's so very obvious that somebody's trying to get a good inheritance, you know, and so that's an interesting thing. Yes, words were what they had. They felt that these words were enamored with a certain kind of power that you just don't find anywhere else. That's the language of the spirit and the word, you know, together. And so they didn't write this to be unique or clever. They wrote it because they couldn't not write it. You have to, this is a story one has to tell. If you know the story, you tell the story, you know, and I don't know, that's what makes it so compelling, even if it's maddening at times, to me. So, all right. Yes.
Verse 29, the crowd standing there heard it and said that it was thunder. Others said an angel has spoken to him. And then Jesus answered, this voice came for your sake, not for mine. So I guess it surprises me that John is telling what has happened, but nobody can figure it out until Jesus just tells them, this is what it means. The fact that I guess the way John puts it, this kind of surprises me. Why didn't he just say this is what Jesus wanted to share with people?
Yeah, it is odd. I mean, Jesus' words saying this is for your sake, not mine, but they're the ones that didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't even know what it was, right? I probably there's not a whale of a difference between angels, the voice of angels, the voice of thunder, the voice of God in the first century mind. You know, they're in a context where the gods, as it were, did thunder. That was one of their languages, right? So I don't think they would hear thunder as just being a natural occurrence of when a certain measure of heat runs into another certain measure and has an audible response. For them, thunder was something out of the heavens to God. So the folks saying it's thunder and the others saying it's an angel were not like the scientific folk and the religious folk. I think they were all kind of thinking religiously here. And so maybe neither of them was wrong. If they thought this was a supernatural voice of some sort, maybe none of them was wrong. But at the same time, they don't seem to really get it. And I don't know what to do with that. I think I said in the video, Jesus says it was for their sake, and they're the only ones that don't understand it. I don't get how that works. What do you think? What's up with the voice out of heaven and the misunderstanding? That's curious.
I just think today we hear so much noise. Is it out of Gaza or out of Ukraine or out of gay, lesbian, or what? We're hearing all this noise in our lives. We get up in the morning, we open a newspaper or our phone and we get noise. Are we just not hearing the same as they thought it's thunder? That's just the noise we're hearing, and we're missing a message to us that is so much more than this noise we get. Isn't there some relation one to another?
Yeah, that's a guy. I love the direction you're taking that. I kind of want you to preach this weekend on the noise from the heavens and the noise and how we interpret it. And that may well be what's going on here. How do you interpret the noise?
That's why we show up here, of course.
To hear the noise?
No, we've heard the noise, we're trying to clarify it.
Oh, yeah, well, that's a lot of pressure here. Yeah, well, only Jesus can do that. I gotta tell you, this is noise to me. Once I got my hearing aids, I became convicted that noise is way overrated. And my happiest moment in the day is when I take them out. Yeah, that's a great direction to take it, and maybe that's sort of what's going on here. We have to give John his due. Jesus says, his voice came for your sake, not for mine. And then follows, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. Or you want to talk about a non sequitur? Where did that come from? It does make me think that the idea that we're hearing angels or we're hearing thunder does make me think that there's some kind of divine presumption there, and Jesus is answering in that respect. But I don't know. It's almost like when Paul speaks about the powers and the principalities of the air and so forth. He uses this language that I'm sure is just chock full of first century meaning. And I can make heads and tails of it a little bit. But I don't know if the heads and tails I'm making from it is what they intend. So when I hear something like the ruler of this earth, it's easy to think, first of all, of the Caesar. You're living under the Roman Empire. But I think it's more expansive than that. Rene Girard, for example, would say the ruler of this earth is the mechanism, the scapegoating mechanism. That's been driving us, whether we ever deliberately called it that or meant to do it. That's how we think. That's how we act. We have been so absorbed into that way of thinking that it drives us, and it has to be cast out in order for us to imagine something else that's new. So even the phrase "cast out," it sounds like the old demonizing stories, right? But it does make us wonder what are the presumptions that we have absorbed by osmosis or deliberately or something about how the world must work that are simply incompatible with who Jesus is, who Jesus calls us to be. And how do you eradicate that out of your life, out of your thinking, out of your presumption, out of the way we act as a culture? I think it's really, really hard. You know, as anti-imperial as the Gospels seem to be to me, it didn't take more than 3 centuries for the church to align itself with the empire and imitate the empire and build its structure on the empire. But you have a pope and you have the archbishop and you have the curia and you just have all of this the structure of the church almost exactly mirrored the structure of the empire. And then with Constantine, conversion, as it's called, the marriage was reset. And that's early 4th century from someone who died at the hands of the empire. That kind of thing, the presumptions of the empire, they are so deeply rooted in us that that you need something like a demonic casting out, something like that. Yes, Shirley, sorry.
Well, I'm just thinking that Jesus never really disregarded the empire and those people. I mean, he said, render under Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God. So I never got the feeling reading scriptures that he was, as much as everything that happened, it was like it was an accepted thing. There's always going to be a government.
Yeah, so I want you to start reading it differently.
Okay.
I do. First, let's make a distinction. That there might be a government, that there would be order. Yes, I think that is the presumption. But the empire had specific ways of ordering that are simply wrong. And Jesus teaches against them all the time.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
I understand.
Right. You love your enemies. You don't
I
kill
just
them,
didn't
right?
feel that he ever thought
Well,
there
and
wasn't going to be order.
yeah, so yeah, there will be order, sure. But it's an order that is set on a whole different set of priorities and value than what is evident in the empire. There is one moment where Jesus, Herod is a part of the empire. He's the regional tetrarch. I'm talking about Herod Antipas, who is the Herod that's in the grown-up Jesus story, not the baby Jesus. He killed John the Baptist. He killed John the Baptist. He beheaded John the Baptist.
Good deal.
It was brutal and unjust, uncalled for. John the Baptist was a prophet. He was speaking the word of God. And Herod killed him. Herod was half Jewish and presented himself as a Jewish leader. And he killed John the Baptist. And Jesus was broken by that. That was horrible. And at one point, I think it's in Matthew's gospel where they say to Jesus something about Herod is wondering who you are, and then you tell that fox that I'm going to be here today preaching. He just goes, and that's the one moment when Jesus specifically puts his eyes on a particular figure of the empire.
He was an evil man.
And does not honor him, not the order he brings, and not so. When Paul writes to the Romans, honor the emperor, and they're the ones set in place for there to be order in the world and so forth. He's talking to Romans who are living in Rome. The Gospels don't share that opinion. And so when Jesus died on the cross, crucifixion was an imperial form of torture. Jews didn't do that. That's not how they stoned people, perhaps, but they didn't have the authority or the nastiness to crucify somebody. That's obscene. And but boy, the Romans did. And so and in Matthew's gospel, as soon as Jesus is born, Herod the Great, the other Herod, he's killing Jewish
They
babies.
killed all the babies.
Jesus is a refugee to cut a knife. So from the get-go, Matthew's gospel clearly is anti-imperial. And from the get-go, so is Luke's. Luke begins by saying, when Caesar Augustus was in place, and so on, so on, so on, so the word of God came to John, not Caesar, John. Luke always making comparisons about who's in office. Just read the Christmas story, and then what's happening in this tiny village in Galilee, because this is where God is. So no, don't read the Bible as if it's promoting anarchy and no order whatsoever, but do read the Gospels as being against the Roman Empire. I don't think there's any way not to read it.
That they were good. No, I think I use it though as a separation of church and state. In other words, I don't understand now in the time we live. That was made so clear in our Declaration of Independence that was important. Separation of church and state. But what they're saying is both are important. Of course, church is most important, but church is first. And so when I go back from the beginning, it was divided, but it happened that the government was truly evil and did terrible things with the Romans and all starting out. Now, we kind of hope that our government isn't quite as evil, although sometimes that's questionable too. And so, I just feel that separation is so important and we don't talk about it at all.
Well,
But that may not relate with what we're talking about now. I understand.
yeah, I think we're getting off the field, but
Yes, I realize that.
but let me say, the conversation of the relationship between the church, a gathering of people of faith and loyalty to God through Jesus Christ, and the state. That's a hard question.
It is.
And it always has. As a person of faith, I don't answer that question primarily through the Constitution. Constitution is where, the state shall not establish. It's a non-establishment. I'm glad that's in there. I think a lot of Presbyterians were the reason why it was in there.
Mhm.
I was at a conversation the other day with a rabbi and a man who has an organization. It's kind of like the one called Braver Angels, where you try to have red and blue groups get together in conversation around table. And that man and the rabbi both said something like they were worried that our democracy might be in peril, and that really it was very important for us to save democracy. And it made me stop and think that my calling is not to save democracy. Neither is yours. As disciples of Jesus Christ, followers of God, our calling is to pursue justice. That's our calling. Now, it does appear to me that, I think Churchill might have said, democracy is the worst form of government imaginable, except for all the other
Except for
forms
all
of
the
government
others.
that have ever been imagined, right? It does seem to me that democracy is a way of organizing ourselves that has the most checks and balances on evil. And I think that's why early Presbyterians were so insistent on democracy. Other early thinkers saw democracy as being chaos, mob rule, as it were. And but the reason Presbyterians wanted democracy is they didn't trust any one person or any small group with too much power. That's their doctrine of sin. Power corrupts. And in order to check power, you have to have balance. That's why we have a judicial branch and an executive branch and a legislative branch, each of whom balance. These were insisted by these early Presbyterians because they didn't trust, they didn't want a king. They didn't want a monarch, and they didn't even want an elite group, although as long as they were in it, they were okay. But the whole purpose of democracy was to spread out power because no one could be trusted with it. And I still think that's true. And I still think having a democratic process through elections and representation and all of that is still the best check on the abuse of power. In that respect, then, and indirectly, I do try to preserve democracy. But I only do it because I feel that's the best way for us to pursue justice. That's the value I have. So when it comes to church and state, there are issues of justice to which we have to speak. And if those issues have been politicized, someone's going to say, well, you get political. And that's too bad. Because it's the justice that we're after, not the partisan politics. And okay, so I'm driving us even farther afield, but remember that there are places in the New Testament where they imitate the empire, the language, the kingdom of God, where you're using the imperial language there. It's the same word, basileus, but the same word the empire used to describe itself. The word Christ had been used by the empire. There's some crossover there. There is some extent to which the New Testament telling a story imitates the empire, but the thrust of that story is that it's usually anti-imperial. It's trying to redefine those terms rather than simply accept the way they've been defined by the empire. So
Sorry, but.
that's all right. You took us an inch off the line and I took us about a mile. That's on me. Okay,
That's all right.
but that's because nobody else has asked
We
any
always
questions.
learn from something. It's true.
Okay, yes,
I'm gonna take it one step farther.
all right.
What does that mean for today? And we take a look at what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And most of the countries, probably the majority of the countries are against what's going on there, but Israel will not let up. So, yeah, I'm just trying to think of, is it good to be united as, countries? Because, I mean, they are providing, food and things for Gaza, but they're not completely united, so there's still a lot of conflict there.
Yeah.
Or should we as a country say, wait a minute, this isn't working out, and we're going to take a different position. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not going to share them. Let me skip past your question and get to what I think might be a more interesting thing for us to talk about. The notion of country. It's built on a principle that we are a people who share certain core identity. it may be boundaries. But how many countries in this world, the boundaries were set by colonialists and don't have anything to do with who they are? I mean, when in Rwanda, when suddenly you have these Hutus rising and killing Tutsis and so forth, this was all the effects of colonialism, where the British Empire had said, we're going to call this area Rwanda, and the minority people there are Tutsis, so we're going to educate them and put them in charge, because they'll be easier for us to handle, and they can keep the others under the thumb. And you know, years of resentment and stuff, because Tutsis and Hutus have different values and so forth. So really, what makes a country a country? You know, why do we get Texas? Why isn't that part of Mexico, right? Why isn't California? If you look at the history of what makes a country, this is not something necessarily to be all that proud of, right? But at the same time, we value patriotism of some sort, and honestly, I think television has given us more of a shared identity than anything else. Because of television, people on the East Coast and West Coast dress pretty much the same. Whereas before, you could almost tell where you were just by the things people wore, by their accents and all of that. You know, we've had this kind of great leveling over the years. But we still, you know, the question is for any country, not just us, what is identity? Israel was established as an independent nation, 1948. Less than 30% of the Palestinian families that were living there at that time are still there. What happened? You know, who are they as a country? You know, the whole nationhood thing is a real question. But for another day. Daryl is wanting to explore the seed thing a little bit more, and I'm kind of with her on that. You know, what does it mean for us in our daily faithfulness to know this metaphor that a seed has to die in order to bear fruit? Does it mean that unless you are so radically for Jesus that everybody gets up to here with you and puts you to death, that you haven't really been faithful? I hope not. I think not. But what does it mean I mean, let's think beyond physical death. I think last week we had a sense that you can either live toward power, privilege, prosperity, all the other pieces, or you can live toward truth, love, so forth. To do that requires giving up some of the things to which you may feel entitled. Think about what it takes to forgive somebody for something. There's a huge cost in forgiving somebody. If it's a debt, there's a literal cost. But, you know, say somebody has done you wrong. I mean, really, honestly, and it hurt you to the core. For you to forgive them, you're having to lay aside what rightfully feels like your payback. You have to lay that aside. And you have to lay aside what rightfully feels like your anger at this person and your desire to give them what for. If you forgive them, it doesn't mean they're off the hook. I mean, it means in some ways you're off the hook.
Yeah.
You don't have to carry all of that anymore. But it's hard. It's hard to let go. And you know, they may turn around and see you as a softie and do it again. That's where the question, how many times do I have to forgive somebody, really gets hard. Especially when Jesus says not 7 times, but 70 times 7, right? So we don't have to think of physically dying in order for fruit to bear. But sometimes just laying down what feels rightfully ours, or what we've been taught is ours to grasp, may be necessary for the virtue of living God's life can be expressed. And I think forgiveness is a really, really prime example of that. It is costly. You have to lay it down. And I don't know if I'm always capable of doing it. Does that make sense? As
Makes sense.
a way of dying, letting down, letting go of what might feel like rightfully ours. Yes, ma'am.
I always, the correlation between the seed and a person always seemed to me, even as a young person, I feel like somehow in Sunday school or something, I must have been taught this, because I think that everything in nature almost comes from a seed. Even if it's a bulb, it's still a seed of some sort. So when it goes into the ground, there are so many things that has to happen. There has to be rain, there has to be sunshine, no, not heavy winds. There are so many things that happen to it, has to happen to it for it to actually bloom.
Right.
I always felt that we as people, we come more or less from a seed too. I mean, people don't want to get too sexually involved about that, but it's a fact of life. And in our growing, and as we grow, what we need to bloom more or less, I've always felt, for me, came from my faith. In other words, for people that did not have a faith, they didn't have love growing up, they didn't have all these things growing up, they didn't develop things that maybe I was fortunate enough to develop, because I had that through family and love. And so I've always felt the correlation between nature and the seed is very similar to our lives. And I think that for me, not everybody, that doesn't mean a Muslim or an Islamic, anybody else can, but my Christian faith, through my parents and all, taught me these things that I need to be able to forgive. It's hard to forgive if you've never been treated as anything but, that sort of thing. If you don't have that experience, does that sound way out?
No, it doesn't. I'm very happy and thankful for those who have that kind of upbringing that does equip them for it.
But it's a lot don't have that.
And a lot of folks from the church end up getting a different set of values.
That's true.
It can be really sad at times, but yeah, sure, I think that's great.
But what I meant was we all came from kind of a seed.
Yeah, so the seed metaphor works in a couple of different directions. Every metaphor is going to break down at some point. Let's just be honest about that. But the issue here is that the grain of seed dying in order to fruit. The issue in the parable of the sower is, boy, look how many seeds don't do anything. They just don't take. And anytime you have one of those trees with the little helicopter seeds that come down, there are a gazillion of those things that come down. If they all grew, you never get anywhere, right? So and that's true of all of the seeds that just kind of fly around in the world. So that's another metaphor, another direction that metaphor could take. When you see a metaphor like that, you kind of have to let it stay within that context. So one of the people online, see, we got Betty and Beryl, and when they make a comment, a little B comes up. So it's either Betty or Beryl. Said, I love the way the Confession of 1967. All right, so we have a book of confessions that's part of our Constitution as the Presbyterian Church. And one of the 20th century documents in there is called the Confession of 1967. It's all about reconciliation. And there's language in there, Betty is reminding us, that calls it the cross of mystery. And that people take different stabs at trying to understand it. And that we need to be generous toward one another in the way that various people try to understand a mystery. Maybe not so much confident in our one particular interpretation and generous toward others. So that makes me now want to go back to my office and pull down my book of confessions and get back into the confession of 1967 and kind of see the language they use there, because that sounds, I think that sounds really promising. All right, any other questions about our text? Yes, sir.
And in the forgiveness, I find it easier to forgive others than to forgive myself.
Yeah.
How does that
That's true.
tie in?
Yeah.
To pass that by and just.
No, I don't want to. I really don't.
That's often so true.
Yeah, and I think for a time, you should consider yourself as in more than just one way. You can be the hurter and the hurtee at the same time. And in that mix, I think it's profound that people have always thought of, me, myself, and I, or I have a body, soul, spirit, strength, heart. We talk about the different aspects of who we are. We're an individual entity, but with different aspects. And one of your aspects is that you are a beloved child of God. And therefore, the way the rest of you treats you as a beloved child of God is important. And if nothing else, I would just invite you to exercise forgiving yourself, because you are that special to God. And that's the part of you that doesn't change. So I get it. We're all one person. I'm really like bifurcating ourselves too much. But in some respects, that whatever else you've done, you are a beloved child of God. And if nothing else, that's the one you have to forgive. That's the one you want to forgive. Because God is pulling for that beloved child. And this is an act of faithfulness, is to forgive yourself. Because you're more than the sum of your parts. You're a beloved child of God. And beloved child of God should be forgivable. And I'm only saying that, I'm looking at you because you're the one that raised the questions. And I'm going on and on about it because I struggle with that all the time. And I think people who are conscientious, that's part of the struggle. But even those of us who are conscientious and have high expectations for ourselves, and therefore can be woefully disappointed with ourselves, we are never not beloved children of God. And if nothing else, that's who we should be forgiving in this process. But I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that helps. Maybe it doesn't. It does take us to the end of our hour together. So we really stayed on this text today, didn't we?
But we have a sermon coming.
We have a sermon coming. Oh, I haven't given that.
Is part of your sermon gonna be on an hour in the judgment? Because I was looking at my notes from your lecture and I still don't understand it.
Yeah. Probably not. Yeah, I'll tell you, judgment language is hard for me to use in sermon, because that word itself and the nature of it has been used so destructively in the church over the years. I don't want to join that chorus. And I think it needs a radical redefinition, but I don't know how successful you can be in doing that, especially in one sermon. In the end, it is my firm belief that we will all be judged and found to be beloved children of God. And that will be
Is
the
that
final,
what John is
that will be
saying?
the final judgment. I'm not sure. I'm just telling you, you're not gonna hear it on Sunday in the sermon, and that's the reason why. I do think that, I don't know, I'd have to kind of kick the tires on that a little bit more before I could say anything like that with certainty about what John is saying here. So I appreciate your question. I just don't know if I can answer. Okay. All right, that really is all the time we have, and I have to stop the recording. And I've never done that before. So if you want to see me quizzical, here I am. Bye, Betty, and bye, Beryl. Great having you.